This is a program about the humour of Jesus, and to talk with me about the humour of Jesus is Terry Lane and also Peter Crofts, who runs the Laughter Centre in Sandringham. Terry, if you had to pick one story that illustrated the humour of Jesus, what would it be?
I think it would be where he uses his one-liner about it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But that doesn't sound terribly funny to us. I mean, the idea, the hyperbole, the exaggeration that's involved in it is obviously droll, but it's not the sort of thing where you'd roll around the ground holding your sides. But the reason why I picked that is because I think that there is a lot of aggression in the humour of Jesus. If we take some of his one-liners, they were never spoken as abstractions. Jesus wasn't just walking around talking about the meaning of life. Now, I'll tell you a meaning of life joke to give you an idea of what I mean. At the start of Annie Hall, Woody Allen comes on in front of the camera, and he just stands there and talks directly to the camera, and he said, "I'm going to tell you two stories that illustrate what I think is the meaning of life." And the first one that he tells is the old Groucho Marx joke about, "I wouldn't want to belong to any club that would have me as a member." Right. That was the first one. Right. But the second one was, still a good he said there were two old ladies who went to a health farm upstate New York, and they were sitting one day discussing the quality of the meals, and one said to the other, "You know, Rachel, the meals here are dreadful. The food is something awful." And Rachel said, "Yes, Ruth, and such small helpings." Now, he said, that sums up for me the meaning of life. It's dreadful, but there's not enough of it. Right. Now, that's a meaning of life joke, but and it's not directed at anybody. I mean, it's not directed at the characters in the joke. It's just to make you look in at yourself and really makes you examine your own anxieties. What does it all mean? But when Jesus told jokes, they were always against other people. Now, he told anti-Pharisee jokes, he told anti-Roman jokes, he told anti-priest jokes, but he had a lot of anti-rich people jokes.
Against people. Now, is that the way you would describe it? Was he against people?
Well, I think he was. If I could just finish with this illustration, that there was a general belief, I think, in Judea at the time, that one of the surest signs that you had God's favour was that you were rich. It's obvious, isn't it? If God's pleased with you, he'll make you rich. Right. Now, this is believed now by fundamentalist Christians of the moral majority persuasion in the United States. That's how you know that you're in favour with God. So Jesus said, when somebody said to him, well, what about the rich man? Presumably he'll find it very easy to get into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said, look, it's easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about what that means, but and you can analyse the guts out of the joke, but the joke is obvious. It's a joke of hyperbole and exaggeration, and it's directed against a certain group of people, because what was the comeback? Immediately, the person to whom the joke was told said, "But if a rich person can't get into the kingdom of heaven, who can?"
Yes, right.
Right. Exactly. So it's a hostile, sarcastic, aggressive joke. And I reckon that a lot of Jesus' humour was like that.
I sort of see it this way. If you want to know what God thought of money, you've just got to look at some of the people he gave it to.
Yes. But do you agree with Terry's statement about the humour of Jesus being sarcastic?
No, I don't agree that Jesus used sarcasm to the stage where the fun went out of it. I agree that he picked his targets and he knew how to fire his irony arrows, but there was the essential communicating value there, that he was communicating with people and trying to, in some way, show them their faults through humour, I think. Through humour, by illustrating, by exaggeration, and other things.
You see, if you take the view that it was sarcastic humour, it's negative humour.
That's right.
You're saying it was positive.
Well, I'm saying that it was positive humour in the sense that a sarcastic person, positive humour is telling, clowning jokes, telling jokes about universal human folly, jokes about people in general. A quote that I like is from John F. Kennedy. And he said that there are three things in the world which are real: God, human folly, and laughter. And the first two are beyond our comprehension, so we're left with the second. We're left with that laughter. Now, I think that this is the way that Jesus used his humour. social comment, yes. A touch, perhaps, of sarcasm, but done in a playful way.
Well, if I can just say a bit more about why I think that that Jesus used fairly aggressive and sarcastic humour, because, as I was saying, he wasn't teaching abstractions about the meaning of life. I mean, at certain times he was. When he was delivering the Sermon on the Mount, and he was saying, "Blessed are the cheesemakers, for they shall," and "Blessed are the Greeks, for they shall inherit the earth." This is a Monty Python joke you'll recognise.
Yes, I did sit by, yes.
Yes, thank you. But so when he was doing that, that was what I would call meaning of life stuff, because actually the blessed means how happy. You want to be happy, right? Be meek and you'll inherit the earth. Be a peacemaker and you'll be known as a child of God, and so on. So he did a bit of that, but also he was teaching in a social context where there was an establishment that he was constantly attacking, a conservative establishment that controlled the wealth, and it controlled the religious establishment. So he made jokes about people's phylacteries. This is not a dirty joke, you understand, but you know, the boxes that people wore in front of their eyes where they had little bits of the scripture, so that they always, I mean, it's a joke in itself, because they were interpreting the Old Testament literally, that you should always have the scripture before your eyes. So they had these little phylacteries there between their eyes, and they made them bigger and bigger and bigger as a sign of increasing piety. So Jesus made a joke about that. You know, he said, it doesn't matter how broad you make your phylacteries. What does it matter? What does it say about a person? So he was attacking hypocrisy. He was attacking conservatism that saw religious values entirely in institutional terms. And I think for that reason, when he was directing his jokes against that establishment, he used what I'd consider to be fairly heavy-handed sarcasm, because he was demolishing them. Now, I'll give you an illustration. I remember back in the days when, back in the Whitlam years, you remember the Whitlam years?
Yes, I do. I was young at the time.
Yes. I was talking to somebody about the way in which it seemed inevitable that Gough Whitlam would win the 1972 election against Sir William McMahon, or Mr. McMahon as he was then. And this person said to me, politicians can withstand anything but ridicule. And he said, when the cartoonists started drawing Mr. McMahon's ears bigger and bigger and bigger, the bigger they got, the more obvious it was that McMahon was doomed. Now, I'll give you another illustration of that. When in the last federal election campaign, Bob Hawke said, you can't hide your money under the bed because that's where the commies are, at that point, Malcolm Fraser looked ridiculous. And that was the watershed in that election campaign. I don't think that anybody doubted after that moment of ridicule that Hawke was going to win in that contest with Fraser. Now, all of that is to illustrate that what Jesus was doing was he lacked any physical power or political power against the establishment, but he could ridicule them. And that was what he did, and did it mercilessly.
Well, Jesus did use humour as a teaching technique. And if anyone is upset about the fact that of humour in Jesus, that's not new, because Jesus told stories and people did get upset. But he told stories with parables. Parables are a form of riddles, and riddles are a form of humour. So he taught with humour, saying and doing serious things without putting on airs or without becoming self-conceited. So his form of humour was more virtue, as opposed to being sarcastic.
But
as opposed to being mocking.
See what I mean, Peter, that I'm saying that he had different forms of humour for different purposes.
Right.
So when he was talking to a group of what we might call peasants, or the hoi polloi of his day, then the humour was gentle. There's humour in the story of the prodigal son, for instance, but it's a gentle humour. Although it's got a sting in the tail, which is, again, is a sarcastic sting, which is directed against the establishment.
Yes, yeah, well, there's a touch of that. You can't deny that. That's there. But see, what you've got to understand is that when you deliver humour, you've got to take into consideration that there's the tone of voice that it's said in, the facial expression that's used, and the feeling. You take into consideration the way it's presented, not just the context. And I sort of feel that whatever Christ said, he said in a humorous way, not in a malice way.
Yeah, but I think that we can be unduly concerned about the malicious side of the humour, because when we were talking about humour before, I made the point that the basis of a lot of humour, if not all, is aggression. That
I'll argue that way.
Well, when we became a type of creature that was no longer allowed to immediately give vent to anger or irritation or rage against a person, where it was no longer appropriate if a person annoyed you to just haul back and hit them in the nose. We had to learn to store up all that aggression and rage. And it can be many years later, it can come out in the form of a joke. Now, I'll give you let me give you a really sick example of this. You know that during the 60s, when German industry was burgeoning, that they brought in a lot of people that they called guest workers. A lot of them were Turks. Now Germany has really only a relatively small percentage of its population is Turkish in origin, but there's a lot of hostility directed towards them. People really want to get rid of them. Every political party has agreed they should be got out of the country because we don't need them anymore. Now, there is a joke going around German schools at the moment, which is this: how do you get 8 Turks into a Volkswagen? 4 in the seats and 4 in the ashtray. Now, you can only understand that joke if you understand all the bitterness that is stored up in the German experience. We're tired of being the villains of the 20th century, but at the same time, the gas ovens are a part of our
So in other words, we're only left with humour. Humour releases that aggressive energy.
Well, that's right, and that was the point that I was getting at, that Jesus could use very, very powerful and, in a sense, very cruel humour to release the frustrations and the anger of the ordinary people who were listening to him.
Yes, but I also have the feeling that humour frees people, that it encourages them and that it affirms them.
It does.
As well.
It's a tremendous liberating force.
I'd like to pick up on your camel and eye of the needle later, but to come back to you, Peter, if you had to tell a story that was illustrating the humour of Jesus, what would you come up with?
Well, I don't think I'd take anything out of the Bible. I'd tell a joke, basically, which is to do with a minister who had a similar sense of humour to Jesus. And one day in church he said, friends, in this hand I have 3 sermons. I have the $100 sermon, which runs for 5 minutes. Terry's heard this.
No, but I like it already.
I have the $50 sermon. I have the $50 sermon, which runs for 30 minutes. And I have the $10 sermon, which runs for a full hour. Now I'm going to take up the collection and see which one I tell. So what's saying there is that it's up to us to see the humour of Jesus. The more you put in, the more you'll see.
Yeah. Well, actually, your comment about Jesus and the rich reminded me. The Mavis Bramston show illustrates this way of doing it, when there was 2 society women who were talking about all of the people who were starving in Asia. And one says to the other, well, I can understand why they're starving. I've never found Chinese food filling. and you know, it's this total understanding, lack of comprehension of the situation that's being addressed. So what you said before, Peter, was that humour was an essential part of the teaching method of Jesus.
Oh, very much so, very much so, because Jesus was aware that humour allows religion the insight to adapt, to appeal to many different people, to go anywhere and do anything. And that's something that religion just can't turn back today in the space age. They've got to have something that's capable of doing that. Now, religion can do that, can take you anywhere and you can do anything, once you learn the difference between the sarcastic wit and the clowning wit. Now, that is something that you can learn. You can learn that. It's an attitude. There's techniques, there's formulas. It's a serious scientific study to learn the positive use of humour as opposed to the negative use of humour. I mean, Mark Twain's on record of saying, under the disguise of humour, all men are enemies. So this is the negative humour. We've got to start looking at the positive humour. And I refuse to accept that Christ said anything without that touch of humour.
Yes, actually, your mention of Mark Twain reminds me of that marvellous statement of his, which he said once, that if God didn't want us to be sinners, he wouldn't have made us in his own image. You know?
Right. Right.
Well, look, let me tell you a story that Jesus told about money, and see if you can look at it and say, okay, now what was operating in that was this dimension of humour. There was an occasion when a man came to him and said, look, force my brother or get my brother to pay the part of the inheritance that's due to me. And Jesus made a few responses to that, and then he told them a story, and he said there was a very wealthy man who had all of these crops planted, and he realised that he didn't have enough barns to put all of this crop in when it was gathered, so he said to himself, well, I'll build bigger barns and I'll be able to store up all of this food which is going to come, and then I can say to myself, well, ease up, drink, enjoy yourself, have a great time. And then, said Jesus, God said to this man, fool, tomorrow you'll die, and then you will have to make account of all of this. And then he went on to say, don't get hooked into the money business. Now, what's your reaction?
Well, that brings to mind a joke of mine, which I like, which might be relevant here. It's the one about the fellow who was so rich and such a snob that he refused to get into the same car as his chauffeur. You know, I mean, there's a touch of that there, isn't there?
Yes. Is that the way you would analyse it? I mean, is there more in it than that? Is he saying, look...
Oh, well, of course there's more in it than that. You have to link it with other funny things that he said, like, consider the lilies of the field, they toil not, neither do they spin, yet I tell you Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of these, or that God has counted the hairs on your head. Let's have a look.
It's a constant job. That's how they solve unemployment in heaven.
That's right.
Yeah. It has to work on a day.
Or that no sparrow falls from the sky without God knowing about it. All those things belong together. That on the one hand, he was the man who thought that he was going to discover the meaning of life in an abundance of possessions, and Jesus is saying, on the contrary, what are the most contented things that you see? Right. Where do you see the most contentment? And so he was really using those examples of what I'd call exaggeration to demonstrate that the happiest person is the person who travels light, and that is the most difficult lesson to learn. And you notice that that's all the way through the Gospels. Yes. When the rich young ruler came to him and said, what must I do to be saved? Jesus said, well, what's the first commandment? He knew that one off by heart. What's the second commandment? He had to be helped a bit with that one. What was the third commandment? Go and sell all that you have and give to the poor. The most difficult, and the one that we, of course, find a constant affront. The most difficult thing is to believe, as Thoreau said, when the bailiffs came to take away his goods to pay his war tax that he refused to pay, they found nothing there, and people said to him, look, really, it's easier to pay the tax than have all your furniture nicked by the bailiffs. And he said, the honest man in this life is the one who travels light, who has the least to worry about, the least to guard. And you can think of a good living example of this. One of the few people to whom I've ever spoken who I would apply the description good without any hesitation is Father Brian Gore, when I talked to him about his experience of being in prison in the Philippines. And when you talk to him, you understand what the vow of chastity, poverty and obedience can produce in a person. What it does is that it just simply relieves them of all concern about looking after their furniture, looking after their wife and children. They go where they have to go as free men, or free as free women, free persons. You know, Woody Allen said in Manhattan, my wife has left me for another woman, which is one of his best lines. But you see, when you tell that story of the bigger barns, that it relates to that whole concept of the honest man travelling light through life.
Let me take another story that Jesus told that I think is one of the gems. This Greek woman, who's not Jewish, because she's Greek, you probably picked that up,
Thank you.
Comes to Jesus because her daughter is ill. And first of all, Jesus pays no attention to her, and the disciples say to him, look, just send her away because she's not one of us. She's not Jewish, I suppose. So Jesus then says, because the woman insists, well, I've come to look after the lost sheep of Israel, not for the likes of you. And she says, falls on her knees and says, Lord, help me. And then he says something which seems right out of character. He says to her, should I give the bread that is meant for the children to dogs? I suppose in a way he was calling her a bitch, by implication. And she says, ah yes, Lord, but even the dogs can pick up the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus looks at her and says, your daughter is well, and she goes home and finds that that is the case. Now, it seems to me, I think it was Martin Luther who said that that woman heard the yes in Jesus' no. And that what was going on here was that Jesus was sending up the prejudice of the disciples. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes. Is there a pun in there? You're the theologian. Was there a pun?
What did you have in mind?
I wondered, you know, the reference to the dogs, the children, there was implication, the Greek,
I think.
Yes.
Because the only way that you can have a little dialogue like that is that if it's obvious from the twinkle in his eye right from the start.
Well, that must have been
that there's a leg pull going on.
Yes, right.
I mean,
that's right. That's the essence, I think, of a lot. And a lot of this, of course, is lost because of the cultural comic characterisation of so much of the material in those days as opposed to these days. And of course in the translation too, wordplay humour doesn't translate too well either.
Well, like that attack that one of his attacks at one of the Pharisees, we missed because in the Aramaic he says, you swallow camels but you strain out gnats. But in the Aramaic the word for camel is gamla, and in Aramaic the word for gnat is galma. So it's a pun. It's a play on words that people would have picked up instantly. But you see, we miss that. Camel and the gnat doesn't have that force for us in English.
That's right. That's right. That's also another example of Jesus' exaggeration, because that joke reminds me of another exaggeration joke, which has got the same rhythm and rhyme of that if you put it down around to modern day linguistics. The insects in Surface Paradise are so big they squat back. Yes. You know, it's got the same rhythm and rhyme as that, and that's a wonderful paragraph, Matthew 23, where he runs through all those one-liners. Now, if you switch those around to modern-day linguistics, you'd have a stand-up routine there.
Yes.
There's some very funny stuff there.
And of course, that was said with all of the crowds gathered round and the Pharisees and the lawyers there. Isn't that the one? Well, one of the things he says there is that you lawyers are very good at putting heavy loads on other people's shoulders, but you never lift any yourself.
Right.
He must have been thinking of current law practice.
Going back to the camel and the gnat, I don't want to continue to harp on this aggressive aspect of... But I'm going to.
Yes,
I'm going to harp again, yes.
Yes, right.
Because you have to understand that it's really a joke about kosher, that what the Pharisees did was they very carefully strained their water to get anything out so they didn't inadvertently eat something that hadn't been killed in the proper ritual way. Whereas they'd go around happily eating camels, which you're obviously not supposed to take literally.
Yeah.
So again, the attack against the establishment is that it observes all the outward forms of religion and misses the whole point of religion, which is that it is to transform life and give you an insight into the meaning of life. So that's why I say that Jesus was constantly attacking specific forms of hypocrisy in those one-liners.
Yes.
In a very funny way.
Yes. Well, you see, it makes you think of the story of the two pigs, which you've probably heard about. It used to be three, but one of them joined the church and disappeared. You know, there's a sense in which there's a sense in which somehow the church sucks people out of life rather than puts them into life and gives them more sense for what it's about. And yet that was the intention of all of these ways of opening up possibilities for people, wasn't it?
Well, the reason why not many jokes are told in church, the reason why when clergymen get together, they tell jokes, and they tell very irreverent jokes too. In fact, some I can't exchange with you now, unfortunately, although they're good examples of what I'd call sick religious jokes, and the clergy can do it when they get together. But in the congregation, they dare not do it. And I think the reason is because humour is divisive, and we might talk about how humour divides people. If as a preacher you stood up in church and you told a joke, you can be sure that 1/3 of the congregation will laugh, 1/3 will be bored and say, why waste time doing that, and 1/3 will be offended, because we can't all agree on what's funny. We can't all agree on what is the proper object for a joke. And I think that that's the reason why jokes are not told in church, because the clergy fear dividing the congregation.
Yes, but it could be because humour is subversive of reverence too, and there is this acceptance that in a reverent situation, anything irreverent is taken out of it.
Oh yes, there's a lot of that there too, but I see Terry's point, but the way things are happening these days is we're not so much looking at the forms of humour, and we're not so much looking at the targets of humour. We're looking at the attitude of humour. Humour is an attitude that we can all learn. It's a way of seeing things, of feeling things and perceiving things. Now this is what Christ was talking about. You mentioned before, Terry, the light. Well, I feel light-hearted is a term to go with that. Light-hearted. Have the spirit and the joy of religion in you continually. And humour is this. That's what humour is. And if you push it out, you take a lot of fun out of the religion, don't you?
Yes, well, unfortunately, our time's run out, and there's a lot more we could talk about. But it seems certain that in the hands of Jesus, humour was more than a teaching tool. It was a means of setting people free.
And a means of attack.
And a means of attack, as you insist. But certainly if it's divisive, it's going to have that result. It's going to subvert people's view of the world. But it is liberating, and people who understand this know that the teaching of Jesus is still freeing today. Now, thanks to Peter Crofts and to Terry Lane for this discussion on the humour of Jesus. This is a program about laughter, and in particular the relationship between laughter and religious experience. And to engage in the discussion, I have with me Peter Crofts, who comes from the Laughter Centre in Sandringham, where he teaches people to laugh and sells books on laughter, and Terry Lane, well known in Melbourne. Terry, let me start with the first question, and with you. Why do people laugh?
Well, it's not an original question, you know. It's something that's engaged the minds of philosophers for centuries. But Charles Darwin was particularly puzzled by the question, why do people laugh? Because he could see no survival purpose in laughter. And so he was puzzled by the fact that, you know, when you laugh, there are about 15 muscles in your face that react involuntarily. Then there are the muscles in your chest, there are the muscles in your throat. So all this goes on, and it doesn't seem to have any survival purpose. And Darwin thought about it a great deal and never came up with a real answer, but other people have suggested that in fact the reason why we laugh is because it's an outlet for our aggression. And if we go back to when we were animals, or even proto-man, probably when people were frustrated or when they were enraged, they immediately reacted with violence. But as we formed communities and became more sophisticated, we had to repress the violence, we had to contain it. Now the theory is that what laughter does is that it releases that repressed aggression. Now I want to tell you two stories. I'll tell you a joke first of all, right, which I think it's a terrible, in fact,
well, make sure it's funny.
Yeah, two terrible jokes. Now, you see, this is interesting. You may or may not think it's funny. How do you get babies off a truck?
Oh, no idea.
With a pitchfork.
Oh, I see.
Now here's another one. How do you get a baby into a milk bottle?
I've no idea about that either.
With a vitamizer.
Oh, I see.
Now, I tell you those stories because not everybody will laugh at them.
Yeah.
Because to see anything funny in it, you actually have to have aggressive feelings towards babies. Now, most do because they've either had babies as siblings who've alienated their parents' affections, so you feel that they're a threat to you.
Yeah.
Or if you're a man, you recall your own children when they were babies taking your wife's affection away from you.
Let me check with Peter on this. What's your reaction to that, Peter?
My reaction is pretty much what Terry says. Laughter does release aggressive energy, but it replaces violence and reaffirms relationships. It's a tremendous anti-war weapon. You can't be angry and laugh at the same time.
Can I tell you another story, which is a true story, and then I'd like Peter to comment on that.
Right.
This happened when I was in Nairobi. Now in Nairobi, the public transport is all buses, and every morning they clean the buses, but not in any way that we would recognise. A fellow gets in with a hose and he just simply hoses out the entire interior of the bus. Now, Nairobi is on the Kenyan plateau where the soil is rich and brown and it's like chocolate. And that all day is being tramped into the buses. And what the cleaning process does is that it homogenises this brown chocolate all over the bus. You see. So I was with a friend of mine. We were going from a suburb into central Nairobi, and we were the only two whites on the bus. Now, there's a fair amount of hostility on a bus like that, as you can well imagine. We got on, we sat down, the seats were wet and the floor was a terrible mess. Now, they control the traffic in Nairobi not with traffic lights but with enormous roundabouts, and all the bus drivers think that they're drivers in the East African safari, and they hurl the buses into the roundabouts, you see. So we screeched into the first roundabout, he threw the bus around, and my friend Stuart slid off the seat, bang on his bum, right in the middle of all this muck in the aisle of the bus. And I have never seen so many people so spontaneously hysterical in my life. Now, to them, what they were seeing was the Bwana, the representative of everything that they resented from the colonial days, considerably discomforted. I mean, his nice cream trousers all covered with brown muck. He was carrying a tape recorder and a bag in the other hand. I mean, he looked like a plutocrat in amongst all this relative poverty, and they thought it was hysterical. But reverse the situation and have one black man falling off the seat of a bus in Melbourne, where all the people are white, and you wouldn't laugh, you'd be concerned for him, because there's not the aggression.
Well, that's where we get down to the universal aspect of humour here, deflation of ego. A well-known man slipping on a banana skin is funny. An unknown man slipping on a banana skin is funny. But a well-known man who is disliked slipping on a banana skin becomes hilarious.
That's right.
But the essence of the whole thing is, it's when we slip on the banana skin, how we react. Now, if we react with violence when we slip on the banana skin, when we're being laughed at, we don't have a sense of humour. But if we slip on the banana skin, get up and laugh while the others are laughing at us, then we do have a sense of humour. This is the fine line between the aggression aspect of humour and the realisation, the liberation aspect of humour.
Well, let me pick up that last comment, the liberation aspect. What's the relationship between humour and religious experience? I mean, is it liberating in that sense?
Well, it's nothing new. Religion relating to humour, I mean, it's just a renewal of traditional elements which have been lost sight of. The clown was a religious symbol for years, and people have forgotten all about it. It's just now that people are starting to realise the fact that Jesus told stories, and so do clowns, you know?
I think, if I could say something about this, one of the roles of religion is reform, to actually change the way people behave, and there are two ways you can do that. You can beat them about the head and bully them into changing, which tends to be very slow. Let's say it's the Marxist approach of taking over the state apparatus and bullying people into being good.
Yes. This is not a political program.
No, but there is the slower Christian approach, which is the conversion of the individual, changing the will in the individual. And you can do that more effectively with humour than you can with bullying. And I'll give you two examples. One is Gulliver's Travels. Most people don't realise that Gulliver's Travels was in fact a satire, but when Gulliver washed up on the beaches of Lilliput, and he eventually came to terms with the Lilliputians, and they undid him and they let him go, he found that they were locked in mortal combat with the Blefuscutions. Now, the Lilliputians and the Blefuscutions were the Americans and the Russians of their particular time and place. And so he asked them what it was that they were fighting about. And very few people could remember, but those who could remember what it was that had started this off explained to him that it was a disagreement between the leaders of the two countries over which end they should open their boiled eggs. Now, what Swift was trying to do was to demonstrate the essential lunacy of international hostility. Yes. Now, if we bring that up to date, what is the most effective anti-war film ever made? It has to be Dr. Strangelove. Yes. Oh. Because what Kubrick did was he turned the whole thing into a joke. Now, it's interesting, there is...
The Great Dictator was another example.
Well, true,
yeah. Great movie.
But there's a straight version of Dr. Strangelove called Failsafe. Exactly the same plot, the same sort of thing, the accidental firing of a missile at Moscow in that case, and Henry Fonda's the president who has to negotiate with the Russian premier, and they agree that the Russians will drop a bomb on New York and everything will be equal. Now, there's nothing funny in that at all. No. and it is nowhere near as effective as a changer of men's wills as Dr. Strangelove.
That's right.
And that's why I think that humour is very important in...
Exactly. My guess is the jokes that have been told at the negotiating tables have possibly prevented nuclear war more than by any other means.
Mm.
Yes, but you'd think then, if it has that kind of liberating function, as you've suggested, that people in the church would laugh a lot, and it seems to be the opposite.
Well, what happens? The problem is humour needs liberating. That's the problem. Humour needs liberating. Because of our programming, we push the humour, the fun, the laughter and the joy deeper inside. Wipe that smile off your face. Settle down and get serious. This is no laughing matter. Don't laugh in church. You know, we've got to liberate ourselves. We've got to start to put the fun back into religion, the joy back into religion.
Well, let me ask you a question. Was Jesus a humorous person?
Oh, for sure. Well, let's hope he is, because if he wasn't, I'm in a lot of trouble. But yes, well, how could he gather young people around him and old people and simple people around him if he wasn't a humorous person? I mean, if he was a grouch, they wouldn't sit around and listen to him, would they?
Well, we are guessing, because we don't know whether some of the things he said were jokes, because jokes don't travel. That's one of the problems, that you find it a little bit difficult to know whether some of the things that he said were just straight aphorisms, like mottos, or whether they were real jokes. Now, if you take something like the story of the Good Samaritan, for instance, we've analysed that and analysed it, and we've turned it into an allegory or a metaphor, and we looked for meaning in all its little bits. And Margaret Thatcher has a Friedmanite interpretation of the story of the Good Samaritan. She says, the moral of the Good Samaritan is that the Samaritan had money, and if he had not had money, he would not have been able to look after the man who'd fallen amongst thieves. Now, that in itself is funny to those of us who think that to apply a Friedmanite interpretation is funny, but it obviously is not the original point of the story. And so if you go back and you ask, when Jesus was telling the story, what's the most important part? It could well be the two priests who went by on the other side of the road and did nothing. Now, the crowd who were listening to Jesus telling this story, they may have recognised the two priests. This is a great joke in which the point of the joke is the hypocrisy of the two priests. Ah, yes, we know those fellows. They would have been instantly recognisable as a caricature of people who were well known. So Jesus could have been telling a joke, and we missed the point.
That's right. I agree there 100%. Once you translate verbal wordplay humour, a lot of the humour's lost.
Except that I would have thought that what was one of the reversals in that story is that everybody was expecting one of the characters to respond in the appropriate way, and then the least expected character is the one who actually makes the response. Now, would people have laughed at that? It's not the kind of humour or the kind of reversal in which people have a belly laugh, is it?
No, but reversal is a basic form of humour. It's a basic form of humour, and it's the unexpected. The reverse is the unexpected.
Give us an example.
Well, is my wife ugly? When a mouse sees her, the mouse jumps on the chair.
This man is the worst stand-up comic I've ever...
I'm a sit-down comic.
Yes, well, that's why we're sitting there.
Yes, my wife went to the West Indies.
Yes, right.
Come on, you can do that.
No, Peter, let's go on.
So that's one basic formula.
Yeah.
But see, the thing with Jesus is that the humour wasn't so much in his words, but it was more or less in the context the words we used. Sort of like the understatements, the incongruities, and the irony that was used by Arthur and Terry in the Minder television show.
Yeah.
It was this interreaction, this personal touch that Jesus had with his humour. And it's evident.
What other forms of humour?
Oh, goodness.
Jesus used?
He used a lot of forms of humour. He used truth humour, mirroring reality, implication. He implied quite a lot of serious things with his humour. Double meanings. He used a lot of double meanings. Comic comparisons. He used a lot of comic comparisons in Matthew 23, where he said you can see the speck in another person's eye, but you fail to spot the piece of 2x4 in your own. Yeah. Comic comparisons. There's a lot of humour there. But you've got to see it, seek and you shall find.
Yeah, well, that suggests, doesn't it, that humour's not it's not just laughter, it's got a whole range of possibilities to it in different forms. If you had to illustrate something apart from the Good Samaritan about the humour of Jesus, what would you pick up?
Well, I'll tell you a joke first of all. I mean,
Oh, by the way, Jamaica?
thank you very much.
Yes.
That's very, very good of you. Yes.
Yes.
How do you make a Venetian blind?
Yes, right.
Yes, right. The Pope died and went to heaven.
Yes.
And when he got to heaven, he found he wasn't obviously the only person who died on that day, and he was at the end of a long queue stretching up to the pearly gates where Peter was checking people's credentials as they came to the gates. And the Pope was quite indignant about being put at the end of the queue, so he marched straight up to the head of the queue and he said, "Excuse me, I'm the Pope." And Peter said, "No favourites here, everybody treated exactly the same. This is not like it is on earth. Back down at the end of the line, will you please?" So the Pope trundled down to the end of the line and stood there. And while he was standing there, a chap in a white coat, stethoscope, black bag, just strode past the line, right up to the gate, had a word in Peter's ear and was let right in. The Pope was furious. So he marched back up to the front of the line. He said to Peter, "Look here, I'm the Pope. This fellow walks straight up to the end of the line, has a few words with you and you let him in. Who is he?" Peter said, "That's no fellow, that's God. He just likes to think he's a doctor sometimes." Now, I tell you that story because it relates to something that Jesus said when, in one of those one-liners in Matthew that Peter was talking about, he calls the priests of Jerusalem whitened sepulchres. Now that's not a great joke to us, but to people who were familiar with the process of painting the outsides of tombs without doing anything about tidying up the rubbish that was on the inside, and inside it's all death and decay and stench and rottenness and so on, it becomes a funny one-liner.
Incredibly so.
Why do we see the story about God and the doctors as funny? Because we think of doctors as pompous people who deserve to be taken down.
I didn't laugh. Some of my best friends are doctors.
But you see what I
Yes,
mean? That you've got to know something about the object of the joke
Oh, yes.
before you can really understand whether it's funny or not.
That's right, exactly.
Come back then to this matter that we've already raised once or twice. And going back again to the situation in Palestine with Jesus trying to teach and to work with people. You could conclude, couldn't you, that humour, or laughter, but certainly humour, is a liberating force, essentially is a liberating force.
Essentially a liberating force.
Is that why he tried to do it?
Well, if I can just explain just how much of a liberating force humour is, if you look at the component parts which go into developing a sense of humour, these component parts are flexibility, spontaneity, unconventionality, playfulness and humility. Now, flexibility is our willingness to examine every side of every side and every side of every issue, right? Now, everything's got a third side, a comic side. Now, it's a matter of seeing that comic side, like a fellow who was a bit like myself, 40 and fat. He said the good thing about middle-aged spread is it brings people closer together.
Yes.
We've got to... That's another one of those sit-down jokes.
Yes, right,
But and this is the way Jesus saw things. I think when Jesus said turn the other cheek, he said turn the humorous side. See the humorous side. I mean, a fellow who was robbed, he was happy because he'd saved a fortune because he'd entered a lower tax bracket. He saw the other side and turned the other cheek. I think there's a lot there that we've missed because of things that
Well, if we go back to what I was saying in the beginning, that humour is a release for aggression which has been stored up over the years, there's no doubt that when you laugh, when you have a really, really good laugh, like if I watch Monty Python's Life of Brian, I laugh and laugh until you actually feel, you literally feel light. You remember in Mary Poppins, Uncle Albert used to float around the ceiling because he laughed all the time? And well, you see, you laugh at that because conceptually it's right, isn't it? The more you laugh, the lighter you feel. You actually feel as though there is a release.
a natural high.
Now, Peter and I have both read a book called Anatomy of an Illness by Norman Cousins, who's an American journalist, and he found that he was suffering from cholagic disease, which is the stuff that holds all your cells together, and it's similar to arthritis or rheumatism. And he decided that he would treat himself in two ways. One was with massive doses of vitamin C, which he thinks may have had a placebo effect, but the other was with laughter. So while he was in hospital, he got Alan Funt to send around to him a projector and old episodes of Candid Camera. And then, as well as that, he got all the old Marx Brothers films that he could get. Eventually, they kicked him out of the hospital because he was a disruptive influence, lying there in bed laughing himself.
But curing himself.
Laughing himself better.
Yeah.
That was the interesting thing. And it does relate back to this idea that if you haven't got a sense of humour, if you can't laugh, you can be slowly dying inside.
Yeah.
You're just coming apart inside.
It's interesting, there's a story about Jesus who said to people, you will be condemned out of your own mouth, right? You will condemn yourself. Now, I heard a story the other day about a particular fellow who was up before the courts for setting fire to his bed in the boarding house and also being drunk. So he got up in his own defence and he said, first of all, my lord, I wasn't drunk. And second, the bed was on fire before I got into it. Now, it seems to me that Jesus is saying, look, if you...
It wasn't one of Jesus' jokes, was it?
Well, it could have been. It's that good, isn't it? Yes, it could have been.
It's a divine joke.
Yes, just divine. The point of it was that you find when Jesus is saying to people, you'll condemn yourself, you're not really aware of the absurdity
That's right.
that you're living out of.
Exactly. And we've got to understand that we human beings are naturally funny. We are naturally funny, and if somebody tells us there are 450,536,422 stars in the universe, we'll believe them. But if somebody puts up a sign saying wet paint, we want to go and investigate.
Yeah.
So we're naturally funny, and we've got to see this aspect of ourselves, especially with our humour, because Jesus was aware that humour, that religion, faith without humour, was in danger of becoming intolerance and aggression.
Well, isn't that really the situation that the Pharisees were in? They turned it all into law.
Right.
And a lot of the time, it seems to me, that Jesus spent was trying to break through that understanding of human experience.
Not easy.
Smash it down.
That's right.
Sometimes when humour gets to its most rarefied, where it's very difficult to see what it is that you're feeling aggressive about. If you think about it, you can see that it's something about yourself. And these sorts of jokes are not usually terrifically funny belly laugh jokes, but I like them, like Ogden Nash poetry. You know, Ogden Nash poetry. My favourite is the sauce bottle. Shake and slap the ketchup bottle, first none will come and then a lot'll.
Yes.
Now, what are we laughing at?
Yes.
We're laughing at the fact that the whole human condition is, in a sense, ridiculous.
Yes. Around the maypole dances Miss Prism, plainly not understanding its symbolism.
That's another one.
Right, yeah.
Or weep for Mr. and Mrs. Bryan. He was eaten by a lion, whereupon the lion's lioness upped and ate Bryan's Bryaness. So, I mean, it really makes you look at the very unpalatable fact that life itself seems to be pretty silly and pointless. And I think that that's an essential part of religion. You're constantly asking the question, what is the meaning of it all? What is the meaning of it all? And so when you encounter absurdity like that, it somehow or other takes the anxiety out of the search for meaning.
Yes, I mean, if we were in a perfect world, maybe
There'd be no laughter.
there'd be no laughter.
No.
It's the way we deal with our human folly and our ineptness and our just the human predicament, I suppose, the human condition.
The way intelligent people deal with it.
Yes.
The other ones, the fanatics, deal with it another way. And unfortunately, we're at a stage now where we have to look at the humour way, as opposed to the tragic way.
I see. What would you offer to the church from your perspective?
What would I offer to the church?
In terms of humour. What would you say to a very serious church?
To loosen up. There's a lot of young people out there who are frightened or afraid to make the commitments that the church, or they think the church, wants them to make. Make your message a little bit freer. Let it flow step by step as opposed to bang and shock. Deliver it in a lighter vein.
Yes, but in a sense, you see, there's a kind of understanding in the church that reverence is more important than irreverence, or you can't be irreverent.
No,
you know, that's
right.
not what it's about.
That's right.
And yet what we've been saying suggests that if you don't have a sense of irreverence, then you can't really get into an understanding of what Jesus is talking about.
Oh, I feel that. I feel that 100%.
Can I pick up that point,
Yeah.
because I think
Good
you can
point.
illustrate it by looking at two types of films. What is the most Christian film, getting back to two types, comparisons between films again, the most Christian film that you've ever seen? It obviously isn't King of Kings. It obviously isn't the greatest story ever told, because you look at it and it is such sombre, boring, literal representation that you know that's not Christian. The most Christian film I've ever seen is Heavens Above, Peter Sellers' great film, where, taking this idea of Malcolm Muggeridge, what would happen if a man really decided to live like Jesus, if he came to a typical English town and really lived like Jesus did? The entire economy would be destroyed, law and order would be destroyed, our whole society would simply crumble into a heap. And there's a marvellous line in Heavens Above where the bishop is investigating the Reverend John Smallwood, and he's got a committee meeting, and somebody comes into the room while the bishop's deliberating on this important matter, and he leans over and he whispers in the bishop's ear, and you don't hear what he says, but the bishop says, "Oh dear, sometimes I wish I'd never heard of the Boy Scout movement." And you know, it sums up everything. It's sexual, it's against pomposity, it deflates the pompous apparatus of the church, and yet there's a bit of compassion in it. It's got a little bit of everything.
Yes, you begin to worry me. I suppose you think George Burns is God, really? Do you?
I do.
Yes, you do.
There's a wonderful quote in that movie,
God
by the
probably
way.
thinks he's George Burns.
There's a wonderful quote in that movie, written by Carl Reiner, who's one of the most brilliant comedy writers of all time, and he says, it's a quote by Voltaire, and he says that God is a comedian working to an audience that's afraid to laugh. That's a very good quote.
Yes, it makes you wonder why it is that if humour has this essential liberating capacity, not even physically, to restore you to health.
That's
as
right,
we've heard.
that's right. Internal jogging.
Yeah, internal jogging. However you describe it, it's curious that the church has cut it right out, particularly when one would think that the
well,
figure of
no,
Jesus
it's
was
not
so
curious.
human.
It's not. Sorry, Denham, that's the reversal again, see? It's not. We're getting back to what we were discussing in the beginning, the theories of laughter that have been put forward. In the 16th century, a chap called Thomas Hobbes put forward the sudden glory theory, that we laugh because we feel superior to the people that the joke is actually on. Now, this theory highlighted the aggressive aspect of laughter, and it was picked up by cultural leaders and religious leaders and pushed forward. And believe it or not, about 10 years after, they put forward a sin theory. They said it was a sin to laugh. And it got so bad in those days that when a lady walked down the street, she had a big hat and a big brim, and she held her head down, because if you looked up and saw something and smiled, you've committed a sin. So that's what's happened, and that's built and that's built and that's built to where finally all the fun and all the joy's gone out of religion. We've got to recharge that. We've got to put some more back in.
Well, it seems to me that what we've been talking about on this whole question of laughter and humour is something that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is that humour is a quality of love. And that perhaps is a good note to end on. Our thanks to Terry Lane and to Peter Crofts for talking on the subject. Laughter is a serious business.